Hello friends, Dr. David Katz again with another COVID reality check. This one about the crux of our pandemic dilemmas, and by crux I mean this, a cross, an X, because there are actually two key decisional axes related to everything we do about COVID, and I think we've conflated the two. And there are two provocations for this particular commentary. One is a lengthy exchange I had via email, which I suppose you might call a debate, and I'm pretty sure my correspondent thinks he won. And he was basically pushing on me by saying the messages you're putting out are far too nuanced. People need simple. And if you complicate the message, if you offer nuance, it's going to be misunderstood and misapplied. And that may be true when we talk about what, but it's not at all true when we talk about how. And my impression is that he conflated the two, and maybe all the rest of us have done that too. And the other thing is, the other provocation is in the other direction. This is just out, sitting on my desktop right now, just out from the Journal of the American Medical Association, August 12th. That's today, I believe. And the title is Precision Public Health as a Key Tool in the COVID-19 Response, which argues in exactly the opposite direction, that we talk a lot about precision medicine, about really refining what we do based on who you are, what your risk factor status is. We should be doing the same thing in a pandemic response, and I say amen. But let's get back to the crux of the dilemma. What are the two decisional axes? They're simple. One is what, and the other is how. Our debates, I think, have conflated the two, and I think that has really stalled our capacity as a nation, as a culture, to do the right things. So first, let's talk about the what. The what spectrum ranges from what I've referred to routinely as hunker in a bunker. So, essentially lock everything down, stay away from the virus, just flatten the curve for as long as possible. And that's one of the extreme positions of what. At the other end of the spectrum is liberate everything. Don't lock anything down, and we'll take our chances. And I have rejected both, but I've rejected both by taking a position in the middle. I've argued for total harm minimization. I've said if you lock everything down, you're going to be protecting lots of people who don't need protection, who are at extremely low risk of adverse outcomes from COVID exposure. And you're going to be harming people. You're going to be causing economic ruin, societal collapse, disrupting supply chains, and causing destitution, desperation, depression, addiction, suicide, abuse of children, domestic partner abuse, violence, and we've seen all of that, by the way. So I reject that. That does not minimize total harms. At the other end of the spectrum, liberate my state, and everybody out in the water, and never mind the sharks and riptides, I reject that as well. There is no question that SARS-CoV-2 is high risk for people with chronic illness, and is certainly high risk for older people, and is especially high risk for people who are in both of those groups. Older people with chronic disease, namely nursing home residents above all, extremely high risk. I reject both. But I would argue that the center position, total harm minimization, is actually no more complicated, no more nuanced than either of those two extreme positions, any more than it's more nuanced to say look both ways before crossing a busy street. I guess we could argue looking left is simpler, looking right is simpler, but actually looking both ways is pretty simple. Maybe it's a little more work for your neck, but not much. We all agree, okay, that's the what. We need to look both ways. Well, I would argue we need to look both ways before crossing the pandemic. That's one axis. And I don't think there is any additional nuance really in total harm minimization. Let us protect people in a way that is commensurate with the protection they need. If they need a lot of protection, let's give them a lot of protection. If they need zero protection because they're at so low risk, let's give them zero protection. But let's make sure we match the protections to people's vulnerability, and that way we minimize the harms of locking down what we don't need to lock down, but we also protect people from this virus who need protection from the virus. Total harm minimization. I'll provide links, as I always do, about this, and I'm working, of course, on a column that further elaborates these thoughts. When that's ready, I'll attach it here too. The other axis, though, is how, and maybe this correspondent was thinking that subtlety about how should not be discussed because it's indistinguishable from the what conversation. I totally disagree. How is always nuanced. Almost anything we do gets into the subtleties of how we get it done. So for example, when we decided as a nation to go to the moon, it's a yes-no decision. There's no real nuance in a yes-no decision. But how we got to the moon, lots of nuance there. But what's the difference? Society at large can and should be directly involved in the what decision making. That's dialogue that should play out in plain view. All of us should be involved in what are we going to do? What is the United States of America going to do about COVID? How almost never plays out before the general public because you need expert opinion to sort out how. And frankly, every complicated public health response involves a nuanced how. Even if we don't go to the level of precision public health, even if we just do standard public health, sanitation, inspecting restaurants, basic public hygiene, the how is really complicated. Do you know how a water treatment plant works? You don't need to. You could agree clean water is a priority for our community, but you don't want to be involved in the detailed engineering of a water treatment plant unless you're an engineer. We needed to unbundle those two things. There are two distinct decisional axes at the crux of our pandemic dilemma. What and how. What, from my point of view, should have been total harm minimization from the get-go. Not complicated, not very nuanced, it's just a what decision. That's what our priority should be. We want to minimize the harms of people getting infected with the virus, and we want to minimize the harms of economic ruin and disruption. And we need to now shift to how do we achieve that? And that's a discussion for policy wonks. That's a 1,500-page policy manual about all the different ways this plays out in a population with a diverse array of risks. Now, we might have decided that developing the 1,500-page policy manual was going to take a while. And then we would say, okay, so we know what the what ought to be, total harm minimization, but we're not ready with the how yet, so the first thing we're going to do is lock down for a while, flatten the curve. And we're going to use that time behind the scenes, don't worry, we'll get back to you, to develop the how. And you know, you need to be involved as a citizen in the what decision. But you know, unless you are a policy wonk, and unless you've spent your career developing complex public health responses, you don't need to be involved in the how. When it's ready, we'll report back to you. And we will be looking with the input of a multidisciplinary panel, ethicists and anthropologists and sociologists and infectious disease experts and chronic disease experts and economic experts, and on it goes, experts in social determinants of health, to come up with the best possible how that respects everybody, that respects autonomy, that respects civil rights, but also respects the fact that my obligation to wear a mask begins where my nose ends. No, I mean, I don't just get to say civil liberties, I don't need to wear a mask if that puts you at increased risk. My right to swing a stick ends where your nose begins, and my obligation to wear a mask begins where my nose ends. I mean, that's, you know, we are part of something bigger than ourselves. That needs to be part of the discussion too, but there's a balance to strike there. So I disagree with this correspondent that we need to avoid nuance. I just think we need to unbundle these two crucial decisional axes, and I don't think we ever did. I think the what is a simple decision, and I think the right what is total harm minimization. I think the how is risk-stratified interdictions, where we protect those who need protection and don't protect those who don't benefit from protection, and strike the optimal balance between lockdown and liberate. And I think that's complicated. But I think all public health responses, all public health policy is nuanced and subtle and complicated, and we just have to accept that not everything comes down to a yes-no answer. What may, how almost never does, which is why the how discussion should be deferred to multidisciplinary teams of experts. That is the crux of our pandemic dilemma. We never unbundled these two axes in the beginning, and the result is we have bungled pretty much everything.